This is not your typical spooky story about something terrifying happening to me. Instead, it's about something that almost happened, something I nearly became, the kind of person I could have been if I hadn't caught myself just in time. Back when I was a teenager, I didn't care much about anyone. I was rebellious, angry, and bored all the time. My friends and I didn't exactly make good choices. We used to go around breaking windows, causing trouble for little kids, and stealing bikes from the neighborhood just for fun. Sometimes we'd ditch the bikes in a ditch when we were done with them. My parents tried to discipline me, but I never listened. They didn't know what to do with me, so they just let me be. I didn't think anything of my bad behavior. In my mind, I wasn't doing anything that bad, but looking back, I can see how lost I was back then. I didn't respect anyone, teachers, parents, even the police. And I didn't care about the feelings of others. I only cared about what I wanted. One summer evening, my friend Luke and I were sitting on the back porch, smoking, when we got this idea. His dad was sleeping inside, and Luke had gotten his hands on an old rusty handgun. His dad had bought it from some stranger a week ago, and Luke proudly showed it off. I grabbed the gun and pointed it all over the place, not thinking about the danger. At that moment, I had a thought. "We should rob someone," I said casually. Luke didn't say much at first, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. We both knew the neighborhood well, and there was one house we thought would be an easy target. An old woman lived there by herself, and she never locked her doors. We walked down the street, adrenaline kicking in. Luke was nervous, but I was determined. We reached the old woman's house, and I pushed open the back door. It creaked, but it opened. I remember the smell inside. Old furniture, stale air, like nothing had changed in years. Luke froze. "I don't want to do this," he said, backing away. But I didn't care. I kept going, slipping inside, the gun still in my hand. I crept quietly through the kitchen, moving into the living room, where the old woman was asleep on the couch. The TV was on, the sound barely a whisper. My heart was pounding. I stood there for a second, gun pointed at her, but she didn't wake up. I don't know why, but in that moment I was disappointed. I wanted to scare her. I wanted her to feel what I was doing. I moved around the couch, positioning the gun right above her head. I could feel the weight of it in my hand. It was like I was holding power itself. My finger was itching to pull the trigger. And then a voice inside me whispered, "You can do it. You can just pull the trigger and it's over." In that moment, I felt like I had all the control. I almost convinced myself that it was the right thing to do. I wasn't thinking straight. But then something stopped me. My finger touched the trigger, but nothing happened. The safety was on. That's when the reality of what I was about to do hit me like a ton of bricks. I started shaking. My heart was racing. Without thinking, I lowered the gun and walked out of the room. I was almost in tears, the weight of what I'd nearly done crushing me. As I reached the door, I turned back, and for the first time I saw the old woman's eyes. She was awake and her eyes were filled with fear. Tears were streaming down her face. That look broke something inside me. I ran out of there like my life depended on it. I got back home, handed the gun to my parents, and confessed. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't mention almost pulling the trigger or that Luke had been with me. But I admitted that I had broken into her house. My parents were shocked, but they didn't yell. Instead, they called the police. I had to spend some time in juvenile detention for breaking and entering, but that was the wake-up call I needed. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. Even though I didn't see it that way at the time, I don't know what would have happened to me if I hadn't stopped myself that night. But I do know that I never want to find out. I can still remember that night like it was yesterday, and the truth is, I don't think I'll ever forget it. I had been living on the edge for so long, caught in a spiral of self-destruction, and I came dangerously close to making a choice that would have ruined my life forever. Just thinking about it now, it makes me sick to my stomach, knowing how close I came to crossing that line. But fortunately, I woke up just in time. Looking back, I can say that I've never touched drugs or anything like that again. I turned my life around, but it didn't happen by accident. It happened because of a moment that changed everything. In the late 90s, I was deep in the grip of a serious addiction. I was living in a small town, doing whatever I could to get by, spending money on substances, partying with friends, and barely making it through the days. One night I found myself high and desperate, searching for my next fix. I didn't care about anything else. I would get my hands on what I could, use it, then repeat the cycle. But then something happened that turned everything upside down. One evening in the middle of summer, I found myself near an old rundown building, staring at a van that was parked behind it. I didn't think much of it at first. My mind was clouded. My only thought was on getting my next high. But then something inside me told me I should check the back of the van before I just left. It was a gut feeling, one of those things you can't explain. Still, my focus was on the drugs. I didn't care. I just jumped in, started the engine, and drove. I drove for what felt like forever out into the desert. I had a plan to meet up with someone who would take the van off my hands, hand me some cash, and then I'd be on my way. But once I got out to that isolated stretch of road, I decided to finally check the back of the van. I remember the sound of the metal lock snapping when I pried it open with a crowbar, and that's when everything changed. Inside the van, 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, were tied up, gagged, and lying on the filthy floor. They looked terrified. Their eyes were wide with fear, tears streaming down their faces. I froze, the weight of what I was seeing hitting me like a punch to the gut. The stench in the air was awful, a mixture of sweat and something else I couldn't quite place. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. I had just stolen a van that had clearly been used for something terrible. My first thought was that I was in big trouble. The people who owned the van, they weren't just criminals. They were likely dangerous people who would do anything to get it back. I couldn't risk calling anyone for help, especially not my contact. He was involved in shady deals, and if he found out I had screwed up, I knew he wouldn't hesitate to harm me, or worse, harm those kids. In a panic, I made a decision I'll never forget. I climbed into the back of the van and with shaky hands, cut the ropes that were binding the kids. I tried to calm them down, telling them in broken Spanish and English that I wasn't going to hurt them, that I was getting them out of there. But as I saw their faces, the reality of the situation hit me even harder. These kids had been through something no one should ever go through. I couldn't leave them there. I couldn't let them fall back into whatever horrible fate awaited them. I carefully drove out of the desert, trying to be as fast and quiet as possible. At the first gas station I came to, I pulled in and bought some water and snacks for the kids. They were hungry, terrified, and confused. I told them to stay in the van while I walked across the lot. I knew what I had to do. I called the police from a payphone, making sure they knew where I was and what I had found. Then I walked away, feeling like I might be running from something I could never escape. I never saw the kids again, but I found out later that they were returned to their families. They had been caught in the terrible world of human trafficking, but thanks to that moment, thanks to that gut feeling I ignored at first, those kids got a second chance at life. For me, that night was a wake-up call. I was lucky. I managed to turn my life around after that. I left town and went to live with my older brother in Texas, where I got clean and found a way to move forward. I found a good job, built a life for myself, and started a family. But I'll never forget the lesson I learned that night. Life doesn't always give you a second chance, but I got mine. It's funny. Sometimes I think about those kids and wonder if they helped me as much as I helped them. In a way, they saved me. As a child, I grew up in one of the most dangerous areas you can imagine, a crumbling apartment complex in Baltimore. My grandmother and I lived there in a building overrun with some drug dealers, criminals, and a community that didn't hesitate to hurt you if you crossed them. It was the kind of place you'd see in movies like The Raid, Redemption, where every floor felt like a battleground and your only hope was to keep your head down and avoid drawing attention to yourself. Unfortunately, leaving wasn't an option. My grandmother was elderly and frail, and we didn't have anywhere else to go. We were stuck in a place where danger lurked around every corner. Some floors in the building were used for drug manufacturing, others were hubs for distribution, and every night I'd hear shouting and the sound of gunshots coming from below. The air was thick with the smell of blood and fear. It became so normal that I didn't even blink when I'd hear people getting beaten with baseball bats, or when I'd see guns stashed in the hallways. I tried to stay away from it all, refusing to get involved with the drug dealing, even when some of the men in the halls tried to pressure me into running errands for them. But it wasn't always that easy. I got mugged a few times by rival gangs. They'd steal whatever I was carrying, or sometimes they'd beat me just to make a point. Despite all this, I kept my head down, knowing my only job was to protect my grandmother. One day after school, I returned to find our apartment door wide open. I froze. Something was wrong. I stepped inside cautiously and was hit with a sight that I will never forget. 6 men, armed with assault rifles and shotguns, gathered around our kitchen table. The panic surged through me. Before I could make a sound, one of the men grabbed me by the neck and dragged me into my grandmother's bedroom. She was sitting on the bed sobbing. I ran to her side and held her tightly, terrified for both of us. The men closed the door behind us and we were left in the silence, listening to the sounds of footsteps, the occasional whisper, and the steady hum of fear in the air. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. A burst of gunfire erupted from outside the bedroom, and it felt like the world was shaking. My ears rang with the deafening noise as I pulled my grandmother down to the floor, clutching pillows over our heads, trying to block out the terrifying sound. When the shooting stopped, the silence that followed was just as overwhelming. I couldn't hear anything for a moment except the pounding of my own heart. Then the bedroom door was kicked open, and a man wearing a black bandana walked in. He looked us over for a long, tense moment. His rifle aimed at us, but after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked out of the room. It was 30 minutes before I could summon the courage to peek out. When I did, I saw the scene that still haunts me. The 6 men, once sitting at our table, now sprawled out across the apartment, lifeless and bloodied from the gunfight. The room was chaos, furniture overturned, bullet holes in the walls. I knew we had to get out. I grabbed my grandmother's hand and without a word, we left the apartment. I didn't look back. We walked out into the hallway, not sure where we were going, but knowing we couldn't stay there. A kind neighbor on the ground floor took us in for the night, and the next day we went to my school. I told my teacher what had happened, and with their help, we found a shelter to stay in. The building was eventually raided by the police and torn down, but by then we were long gone. We never went back to collect our belongings. I didn't care about anything in that apartment anymore. It was a place full of pain, violence, and memories I would never want to relive. To this day, I still think about that moment, how we narrowly escaped with our lives. It's hard to shake the feeling that we barely made it out in time, but one thing's for sure. We never looked back, and we never went back. We had our lives, and that was enough. In 2011, I made the bold decision to spend my 21st birthday alone, hiking through the Canadian mountains. I'd been camping plenty of times before, but this was different. It was all about proving to myself that I could tackle nature on my own. By day 3, I had made my way to my destination, an old weathered farmhouse that seemed to sit forgotten in the middle of nowhere. I had found it on Google Earth, and my curiosity got the best of me. Before heading back home, I wanted to explore it. I wasn't entirely unprepared. Along with the usual camping gear, first aid kit, compass, and utility knife, I was carrying my father's Smith & Wesson Governor revolver. He had given it to me for protection during my solo trip, and he made sure I was well versed in using it. I had practiced with it for hours before I left, and as I approached the farmhouse, I was thankful for that. I wasn't sure if the place was truly abandoned. The house had a haunting vibe. The ground floor windows were all boarded up, and a faded plastic pinwheel spun lazily in the breeze, stuck in the dirt near the front door. My instinct was to knock, but no one answered. Hesitant, I walked around the back of the house, only to find an old rusty fire escape hanging from an upstairs window, and a refrigerator lying on its side in the tall grass. It seemed as though time had forgotten this place. Returning to the front door, I tried the knob. It was rusted but opened with a creak. I was just about to step inside when a strange feeling crept over me. Someone was watching me. I turned and saw a man with a long gray beard standing by the tree line staring directly at me. It was an unnerving sight, and I felt foolish and guilty for intruding. My hand instinctively rested on the revolver in my waistband. "Hi there," I called out, trying to be polite. "Is this your place? I'm sorry, I'll leave." The man didn't respond. Instead, he stared at me for a few more seconds before turning and walking back into the trees. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. There was something unsettling about his presence, and the last thing I wanted was to head back into the woods with him, lingering somewhere out there. Despite my unease, I decided to enter the house and close the door behind me. I slid a dusty stool in front of the door so I'd hear it if anyone tried to get in. I spent the next hour exploring the house, occasionally glancing out of the windows, half expecting the man to reappear. As darkness fell, my anxiety grew, and I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. I climbed up a narrow staircase to the attic, locked the door behind me, and set up my lantern. After a light dinner, I wrote a few notes in my journal, turned off the light, and tried to sleep. But it wasn't long before I heard something, a faint creaking on the stairs. My heart raced. The sound of footsteps slowly climbing the stairs made my blood run cold. I jumped out of my sleeping bag, grabbing my flashlight and revolver, pointing them both towards the door. "Who's there?" I called out. "If I'm trespassing, I'm sorry. I'll leave. Just don't try to open the door. I have a gun." The footsteps continued without hesitation. They were just outside the door now. I heard the doorknob rattle and panic surged through me. "Stop it! I'll shoot if you try to get in," I shouted, my voice shaking. "Just tell me who you are." For a brief moment there was silence. Then the doorknob started jiggling harder. I counted to 5 in my head, and when it didn't stop, I fired 2 shots through the door, aiming low, hoping to hit whoever was on the other side in the legs. The second the shots rang out, the rattling stopped. Absolute silence filled the air. There was no sound of someone falling back down the stairs, no cries of pain, just silence. I kept my gun aimed at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Cautiously, I walked toward the door, unlocked it, and opened it. There was no one there. No blood, no body, nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, dragging a rusted armchair in front of it to block the door. For the rest of the night, I dozed fitfully, gun in hand, constantly on edge. As the sun finally rose, I packed my things and climbed out of the attic window, carefully making my way down the fire escape. When I reached the bottom and was about 20 steps away from the house, I turned to look back. In the attic window, the old man with the gray beard was staring down at me. I drew my gun and aimed it at him, but I didn't fire. It was a warning, just a silent message that I wouldn't hesitate to protect myself. Then I turned and ran, not looking back. 2 years later, in 2013, I returned to the house with 4 friends. I showed them the bullet holes in the attic door and recounted what had happened. I still go camping, but now I never go anywhere without my gun. You can never be too sure who might be watching you from the shadows, waiting for their chance. And sometimes just knowing you have a way to protect yourself can make all the difference. There's always a reason to be afraid.